Please welcome the speakers for our next panel, Access Denied, Legal Strategies to Defend Public Interest Media.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that fascinating panel on foreign agents, which has taken one topic off our list, which is always good. I'm not going to read out the list of accomplishments of the brilliant panel that I've got here with me today. You can read all about that in your own material, but they are brilliant, and we're very lucky that we've got them here. And just running through, Karen Kaiser, General Counsel, Associated Press, Katharine Larsen, Deputy General Counsel, Litigation, Reuters, and Randy Shapiro, Global Newsroom Counsel for Bloomberg. So it's a great panel, and we're talking about access denied, legal strategies to defend public interest media. And for once, I'm very pleased that we're not going to start with how terrible things are in the UK, but actually we're going to start with how terrible things are in America, which is a very topsy-turvy place. If you've been in my position for all these years, we spend a lot of time groaning about the UK. So we're going to look a little bit at what's going on in the US at the moment. And I mean, watching from over here, we've seen Trump attacking universities, we've seen him attacking law firms, and now it appears he's got public interest journalism firmly in his sights. And as a bit of prep for the panel, I was looking up the variety of insults that he's used when he's talking about media outlets. He's called the press fake news, the enemy of the people, dishonest, corrupt, low-life reporters, bad people, human scum, some of the worst human beings you'll ever meet. And particularly, he seems to dislike the New York Times, who he's called fake, phony, nasty, disgraced, dumb, clueless, stupid, sad, failing, and dying. So, just to set the scene for the verbal assault that is going on against the media at the moment. But it's not just a verbal assault. Earlier this year, he withdrew 75 million funding for Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, and including the Voice of America. So, which was is equivalent of our World Service, effectively, in terms of having a voice across Europe. He's recently sued and re-sued the New York Times, Penguin Books, and two individual reporters for $15 billion. $15 billion. I mean, that alone is just extraordinary. We've had Nobel Peace Prize winning journalist and editor Maria Ressa on Jon Stewart's satirical Daily Show talking about the collapse of free speech and describing Americans as being like deer in the headlights. So it's just a tiny bit of scene setting for you. So Randy, is it really this bad at the moment?
I mean, it's not good. And I support the representation of my cretinous clients. I'll fight for them to the end. I know my co-panelists here as well. But I will start with, I guess, an anecdote that I recently was in our DC bureau, which is a pretty substantial bureau for Bloomberg, and was giving a talk about, things to watch out for these days, which is a little different than past talks I've given, good hygiene for protecting your sources and all that. And I looked around the room, and I saw I'll use an English word, some gobsmacked faces. And then I said, guys, wait a minute. I've been with Bloomberg for 12 years. This is all new to you, but I've been giving a talk like this to our bureaus around the world since the day I got here. So I'm sorry to say, but you're not special anymore. And that's really the feeling, because in the US, I think we felt pretty darn special with that First Amendment thing, which really does not exist in its robustness anywhere else. I firmly believe the First Amendment will outlive our president, will outlive all of us on the stage, but it's definitely more difficult times. And the latest example that I'll start off with, and Karen certainly will follow with her own trauma, is what just happened a couple of weeks ago with the Pentagon. We all, and the New York Times, their lawyers here, and most other substantial news organizations have credentialed reporters in the Pentagon. And what that means is you have a badge, you get to be on site. I mean, various U.S. agencies, provide that privilege, or dare I say right. And that is where you have contacts with very important sources, where you learn things, where, heaven forfend, someone might leak information to you, my goodness. So what happened over the course of the last few weeks was the Pentagon or the Department of War sent around a revised set of guidelines to the various news organizations, or rather to the reporters who are credentialed, essentially saying, you need to acknowledge our new policy, which says that, among a number of other things, soliciting information from Department of War, which is what it's now called, employees, even non-confidential information, could be criminal. Unclear whether it's a criminal act on the part of the employees that are leakers or the journalists. The policy itself was rather unclear. There were some negotiations through the auspices, in particular, of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, which has our back all the time, more so than ever. And we ended up in a unsatisfying place after a number of us had hopes that we would come to some sort of understanding. But at the end of the day, the Pentagon wanted our journalists to sign something that said they've received, acknowledged, and understand this new policy, and understand being a word that really almost none of us could live with. So last Wednesday, all of our reporters were decredentialed, had to go in with boxes and take out belongings. Some of them have been there 30 years or more. And now they will have to do very good journalism from outside the perimeter of the Pentagon. So that's been rather unsettling, but of course it follows on something that Karen's been dealing with.
Yeah, Karen, do you want to tell us about what's been going on for AP ever since a bit of geography got in the way?
Yes, just the geography. And actually, if I can just before that, just to tag on a few more items. I mean, press freedom in the U.S. is really taking a hit these days. And the U.S. has always held itself out to be the standard, a role model, the sort of global model for press freedom, but we've really seen a profound shift this year. And the shift is because of the way the government is attempting to control the media. So I'll just say, look, we've always had a natural tension between the government and the press. It's there for a reason. It makes a lot of sense. The press is there to shine a light on government activities and expose abuses. No government wants its information known, so that tension is normal. It's always been there. But what we're seeing now is a shift. It's a shift in approach. The year started off with a bang. The AP was retaliated against right in the start of the year. We were banned from the press pool in the White House because of our refusal to adopt the government's language, the government-directed language of Gulf of America instead of Gulf of Mexico. And it really thrust press freedom into the spotlight right away. And just to tell you a little bit more about that, so AP made the editorial decision of keeping with the name Gulf of Mexico while still acknowledging the new name that the president had chosen, Gulf of America. But we made that editorial decision early in the year because as a global news agency, the names have to be recognizable to our global audience and not only within the US. So we made the decision in our style book and in our reporting to keep referring to it as Gulf of Mexico. And in direct retaliation for that editorial decision, the government kicked us out. They banned AP from the White House press pool, starting with the Oval Office, first our text reporters and our photographers. We were banned from Air Force One. We were even banned from the larger rooms within the White House where larger events take place that are open to all credentialed journalists. And the White House was explicit. It was explicitly because we refused to adopt their name, and the retaliation was directly as a result of that. So just to explain what we did and why, because I can assure you it was not our intention to be in a lawsuit against the administration at the very start of the administration. That was not a place where we wanted to be. And we tried to send letters, seek meetings, and so forth, while still maintaining our editorial principle, of course. But again, the retaliation was clear. It wasn't going to end. It was very specific. So ultimately, we did bring a lawsuit, and we brought it to defend the principle of freedom of speech. And this has nothing to do with the name of a body of water. It has all to do with the fact that the government cannot direct the language that we use, and the government can't retaliate against us for not using that language. We brought the lawsuit, and we won on the trial level, in the trial court. We won with a resounding opinion. Judge McFadden issued a resounding opinion saying that journalists, that that we can't be retaliated against, that it's unconstitutional, even in a small space like the Oval Office. And one of my favorite lines, and an important line from the case, was the court was very clear. Once you open the door to journalists, you can't then shut the door to others based on their viewpoint. The government immediately appealed, and that appeal is playing out right now. Our oral argument is at the end of November. And additionally, the D.C. Circuit, so the appellate court, issued a stay, and that's a pause in proceedings pending, a pause in enforcement of the order pending appeal. So this is all still playing out, and sort of watch this space. We'll see what happens, over the next few months.
And not only talking about open doors, but we're now closing doors to journalists being able to get into America.
Well, I was going to say, after being kicked out of the Pentagon and the risk of being kicked out of the White House, now there's the risk of being kicked out of the United States entirely. So the next challenge that we've been facing together is in August, the Trump administration announced plans to shorten the I visa, the visa that most journalists had become dependent on in terms of their work in the United States. If there's something that I'm very proud of about the Reuters newsroom, is that we have an incredibly global group of journalists. And so if you look on Reuters.com at our bylines, you will see people from all over the world. And that allows us to report with insights both from the inside and the outside on all of our issues. And so that means we need mobility. And we've, for a very long time, had a robust ability to put people in different countries, again, to give those different views and perspectives. And so this question about what will happen to the I visa is something that's very meaningful to us. In past decades, the I visa was valid for as long as the person's contract. So essentially they could stay in the United States for years, be an expert on various issues inside and outside of Washington in particular. The government has now proposed a 240-day maximum with the possibility of renewal, but that limitation, which is probably, there is a part of the I visa is part of a category that also includes students and other exchange, so that limitation might make sense in the context of a one-year academic exchange, but makes no sense in the context of journalists. And it further raises the question of whether in going in to seek a renewal, will a journalist be retaliated against, asked questions about their reporting, or otherwise feel intimidated about the work that we're doing. And just to echo Randy, our journalists were shocked at this possibility, but one of the things that we can always say to them is, welcome to what your colleagues around the world have been doing, because in other countries, such as Russia and China, we deal with that right now. Our colleagues in Moscow do go in on a regular basis to renew their visas. And so it's not something new to us, but it's certainly a new challenge in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I heard stories about, journalists being called back from holiday and rushed back into the States, and trying to get people back in there just in case it effectively shuts down for the foreign journalist. So, as you say, you just don't think that is going to be the way it is.
Sorry, I was going to add on, what you had said before about the lawsuits against the newspapers. I think it's worth just echoing that point and reinforcing, because it's the first time, I believe, a sitting president has sued news companies, first the Wall Street Journal and now the New York Times, for articles they wrote, $20 billion in one and $15 billion in another. And that's a major escalation of legal attacks against the press.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's one of those things that you always, when you were looking at democracy, you sort of thought we're on the civilized end because our politicians generally don't sue. And you look at Europe and you sort of are a bit, holier than thou because their politicians are suing them. But actually, it's sort of coming home to roost a bit now, how dangerous it can be. And we talk about chilling a lot.
Right.
But $15 billion, I mean, where does that sum come from?
Yeah.
It's just weird. I mean, it is fascinating how quickly things can change. And I guess that's one of the lessons that history tells us about, not being too comfortable in your own space and thinking everywhere else is worse than you are. But let's move across the Atlantic a little and just have a chat about that wider international situation. Because yes, we have spent in the past quite a lot of time talking about Europe and politicians there sort of seeing to sue much more regularly. So Karen, do you want to pick up on that sort of segment and just talk generally about that?
Sure, happy to. So what's happening in the U.S. is obviously happening globally, as you've said, and attacks on press freedom are happening around the world, and they're only increasing, and they come in every form and really from every dimension. So we're seeing physical attacks, digital attacks, legal attacks. Obviously today we're speaking more about the legal side, but they really come in every shape and form. On the legal end, the attacks they're systemic, they're thoughtful, they're well-funded, and they're growing exponentially. We see an abuse of the legal system in the form of SLAPs, strategic lawsuits against public participation. I mean, just to quickly say what those are frivolous, expensive, time-consuming lawsuits that are brought against those who speak out against public issues, not intended to win, just intended to intimidate and silence the press. And the types of lawsuits we're seeing really run the gamut, or I would say the type of legal attacks run the gamut from restrictive laws that criminalize reporting, everything from vague and broadly worded national security laws that criminalize reporting, criminal defamation laws, all the way through laws that might not ostensibly be about reporting, but still silence the press. And those are the financial laws, laws that are formed in extortion and fraud and breach of contract. And those types of laws are being used increasingly against journalists as a method of silencing them. Two very well-known examples, of course, are Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong, who's in prison for 6 years based on a breach of lease agreement. Maria Ressa in the Philippines, Nobel Prize winner, was also fighting her own tax evasion and fraud lawsuits. Thankfully, she was acquitted, but those would have carried a significant jail time. And I'll just say one thing about those types of lawsuits that are against journalists for financial reasons. I mean, they're extremely dangerous for a few reasons. First of all, they paint the journalist as someone not to be trusted, someone who's a fraudster, undermines their message, it undermines who they are, and it erodes trust. Number two, it depletes resources. It's very expensive, time-consuming, and draining to fight these types of charges. And the third thing I'll say about it is that when you frame a case not as a press freedom case, but instead as a tax case, you lose support. The governments don't engage, the public doesn't care, and it becomes a lot harder to fight against those types of issues. And I think some of you in this panel have had to deal with that.
Yes, so I'm going to go back and pick on Europe now. So we actually have a case that's going up currently before the European Court of Human Rights, stemming from something that happened in our Paris newsroom in 2016. The Paris bureau got through the transom what turned out to be an expertly crafted fake press release, reported on it, because we are a financial news organization and we report on news that'll move the market. Within about 7 minutes, we realized it was fraudulent, about a French listed company. And we sent out correction notices. We, spoke to the company. We weren't the only major news outlet to report on it. Nonetheless, the French securities regulator, the AMF, which at some point in the proceedings, which went on for a very long time, itself characterized the press release as a credible press release. Never found the perpetrators, so we're almost 10 years out. Nonetheless, went after Bloomberg, and after a series of hearings that took into account the French vacation schedule and did go on for years, we were fined 5 million euros for basically a strict liability standard, which we certainly don't have in the US, and you don't even have here in Europe. At least it's got to be irresponsible. I'm here to tell you it was not irresponsible journalism. And the fine was levied under the market abuse regulation scheme, even though there is what to the eye looks like a robust journalism exemption. Nonetheless, the Paris Court of Appeal upheld the verdict, although cut it down to a mere 3 million euros because it deemed Bloomberg to have acted quickly and responsively. If not responsibly, we went up to the French Supreme Court. They basically rubber stamped the lower court's decision, and ultimately happily, the European High Court accepted our application, and we have a slew of very august interveners behind us. But that's a little scary. Anytime there's a strict liability standard applied to the press under legislation that was never meant to apply to the press because there is a robust journalism exemption, I worry. The other example of non-defamation, non-privacy laws being applied to the press to ultimately censor them was just before COVID. I spent some quality time in Turkey. In fact, John Yugensu from the last panel was one of our esteemed counsel. Thank you, John. We had 2 journalists that were being criminally prosecuted under the Turkish capital markets law for having their name on a story that reported on the dip in value, the devaluation of the Turkish lira against the US dollar. You don't really think about journalists getting indicted for reporting on currency devaluation stories. Nonetheless, two of our reporters, local reporters in Turkey, were prosecuted. That case also went on for a while because of COVID. Ultimately, and quite honestly, refreshingly, because it's Turkey, they were never put in jail, and they ultimately were acquitted. Very happily. But that is an example, and I should note that even though they were indicted and prosecuted under the capital markets law, there was not a capital market or capital markets instrument mentioned in the story. It was about currency fluctuations. So the inapt law that they applied to our journalist was really, really inapt because there was nothing about capital markets implicated in the story. So I fear that the use of laws like that are certainly not abating, and that's something very much on all of our minds.
I mean, I find it quite interesting because we grew up in the UK, and with the European background, we've sort of, certainly in my head, you've got the European Convention of Human Rights, which is, in case law that says criminal prosecution of journalists shouldn't really happen other than in exceptional circumstances. But the reality is that it is happening. And Katharine, you've got a sort of buzzword for this sort of how this all plans out.
Well, we've heard others on the talk about the authoritarian handbook. We talk about the dictator's handbook a lot as well. And so why is this happening? These types of prosecutions, laws of general applicability being selectively applied to journalists, it's to undermine them, in the hopes that someone might think twice before publishing, or perhaps won't shine a light in that dark corner again. And so one of the greatest roles that we play, all of us here, and including some of the other media lawyers in this room, is to be defenders of our journalists and to make sure that they know that we have their backs, that they can go out and publish the most courageous journalism to run down all of the facts and put them in the public eye. And one of the ways that we do that is that we show up. We show up around the world. We show up in places that we didn't even know existed. And so my place that I didn't know existed was earlier this year. I got a call that we had published a story in January about the transition in power in a country called Comoros. So I immediately Googled, where is Comoros? A 3-island nation near Madagascar that is having elections in 2029. And the president had made a comment in the local language, translated into French, translated into English, and there was a dispute over whether he had said, my son or a child. And so we had reported it one way, and he took offense, and the next thing we knew, the military police showed up at the door of our journalist there, a contractor, not an employee, because we don't have a legal entity there. And it was incredibly important to us at Reuters to make sure that our newsroom knows that we show up for our journalists. We show up not only if they're staff members, but if they're freelancers or contractors as well. And that meant that I called a member of my team and I said, guess what? Comoros, let's look it up. So we turned into travel agents to figure out how you even get to Comoros. Ethiopia Airlines, by the way, 2-stop trip. And Chris on my team, he showed up. He showed up to make sure that he was there for the criminal trial that was scheduled that week, to make sure that he was there to ensure that local legal counsel was giving adequate representation, and to show up in the courtroom to say, we are not going to allow for the intimidation under these criminal charges of a member of our newsroom, and that we will send someone from the United States in this particular instance to be there and defend them. And I think that's the most, a privileged part of my job, to make sure that our journalists know that we have their backs.
Okay. And I also think, it is a very important thing increasingly with the way that journalism is and the financing of it, that there's a lot of freelancers who are out there doing these jobs, sometimes, without the backup of big organizations. And the fact that big organizations will step in where appropriate is also an important part of what public interest media organizations are about. And I guess, we're seeing some of this reflected a bit closer to home as well. So we'll move on the discussion a little bit to the UK, because we have to go here. Even though, we've got Nigel Farage telling us that the UK, the US Congress, so, speaking like to like, that the UK is like North Korea, and, we're busily arresting people for posting social media and hauling them in at airports. And, you know, it's a very uncomfortable place for speech here as well, which just, you know, feels, again, slightly odd. And again, it's sort of coming from left field in the sense that it's not what you might expect. It's not defamation. We will move on to privacy, which is something that is directly there that is still coming onto us. But, you know, a lot of these attacks are left field attacks, and that, as others have said, it's not just using laws that we're sort of prepared for, that we're thinking about before we publish. They're coming from all directions, including the use of terrorism laws against activists and those who, you know, politically oppose. So, Randy, I've mentioned privacy. Would you like to just remind us about where we are on privacy in this country as an American?
I regret having to remind you that the seminal case about privacy now has the word Bloomberg in the caption. And I've learned that Z isn't Z, it's a Z. So Bloomberg versus ZXC is a case that shall live in infamy. And actually, on the way here, Jill, I wanted to tell you, if I'd supplied the photo, I would have put it up there. There was a sign in front of the Supreme Court, which I walked by from the tube, that said free entry, and I was thinking, but not a free exit. Again, 2016, not a good year for our newsroom. We published a story about a former very high-up executive at a company that was, you'll see I'm anonymizing as I go, that itself was under investigation by a UK law enforcement agency. We truthfully reported that the executive himself was under criminal investigation. We dutifully called for comment. We've been in touch with his lawyer on previous stories. We called the agency for comment. Moved forward in seemingly a normal fashion, didn't want to comment. Within a week after we published the story, we got a demand to remove the story because it violated, now known as ZXC's, privacy rights. I did what any responsible newsroom lawyer would do. I got on a plane to New Zealand for a holiday, left it with my colleague. By the time I came back, we were in the midst of fighting an application for a TRO, preliminary injunction, before the High Court. We won that. However, there was an initial ruling that confirmed that ZXC, his Article 8 rights were triggered. I forget if that's the right word. I'm triggered by talking about it. His Article 8 rights were triggered, but the judge at that point found, but Bloomberg, Article 10, press freedom, balancing, you did a good job. You thought about what you needed to think about, so I'm not ordering you to take the story down. ZXC did not give up. The case went on through trial about 2 years later. And again, the story's been up for, at this point, about 2.5 years. We got a different judge that apparently didn't agree with our level of responsibility that the first judge had found, and found that ZXC's Article 8 privacy rights outweighed Bloomberg's right to publish, and that we should have done more, what I'm not sure, and 2.5 years later ordered us to take the story down. We appealed that judgment, had to take the story down in the interim, appealed that decision to the appellate court. I was in London for the argument, and I think March 1st, 2020, we know what happened right thereafter. And at that point, after the argument, my fabulously bewigged QC, now KC, turned around and said, Randy, I never say this, but that is one of the best arguments I've done. I said it was great, totally lost, went down in flames. And the court upheld that and then took it to the UK Supreme Court, and that is the law of the land, which is, unless and until someone is charged, absent extraordinary circumstances, and I'd like to see what those are, you cannot identify who that person is. And it really swallowed up facts about the person's profession. We weren't reporting about someone's illegitimate child or their health issues or their sexual preferences, nothing of that nature that, the media here, and frankly in the US too, has respects that there are, even if there is no right to privacy in the US, as we heard earlier, which as a newsroom lawyer is actually a good thing, maybe not as a citizen, we understand that there are things that, one should not publish absent a really burning need to do that. But here, the fact that a professional at a very well-known company that itself was publicly under criminal investigation, himself or herself was under criminal investigation, can't report in it. And the problem, of course, to everyone, all the UK lawyers and journalists here is, well, then when can you report that? Because once they're actually charged, then your odious contempt of court regime comes into play. So I think there's got to be like a 5-second period of time when if you publish, then you're okay. I don't know, but ZXC has really changed how we all in our conference sitting in the U.S. deal with UK stories, because we have to respect the law of the jurisdiction in which we do business. It's gotten very, very difficult. One of the expectations from the court was that you go through a process when you're analyzing whether someone has a legitimate right to privacy that needs to be respected. You fill out a public interest checklist, which we now do, dutifully in the UK when there's ever a whiff of a privacy claim before, during, or after. But it's really changed the way we approach stories here in the UK.
Yeah. Does anyone else want to chip in on?
I mean, that's exactly right. There are some situations in which being a global news agency is fine because we're making our content largely available to our news clients, so news organizations, broadcasters, newspapers all around the world, and they're making an independent decision whether to publish locally in their jurisdiction. But in some instances, when the law, contempt, reporting restrictions, a lot of the legal reporting that we do can be restricted all around the world, and it really it puts a blocker on us from being able to publish at all. So I think of times like when the Cardinal Pell verdict was announced by the Washington Post. I was just like, yay, because that was one news organization did not have a footprint in Australia, and so they could publish, but the rest of us were gagged and forced to stay silent.
We had this scenario last year with the New Yorker magazine being sort of global geo-blocked here because of a story about Lucy Letby, I think, the nurse who's been convicted. It just shows up that the sort of cross-jurisdictional difficulties that there often are when you're covering these stories, particularly with these then very local nuances that you often don't even know they're there until they come back and bite you in that sort of way. And I mean, I think the same with protests. I mean, we were discussing, for example, with the Palestine Action, whether as a global news organization you would show the banners that people were using that were effectively being said to be breaking the law simply by saying what they were saying, which of course we won't repeat for obvious reasons because we're all lawyers. But in terms of that as a global news organization, covering those sorts of stories can itself be quite tricky. Do you just say, right, well, we'll show the pictures anyway? Do you have a...
No, same as...
Yeah,
really the same.
yeah. I mean, I think that one of the themes that sort of also comes through, and again that we were discussing before we came on to do the panel, was that these problems with sort of cross-jurisdictional issues and concerns also have a very practical impact, which is on what I suppose we would call digital hygiene for journalists. Journalists constantly are traveling around the world and taking their equipment, and that of itself is throwing up practical problems for them. Katharine, did you want to say something?
Sure. I think some of the guidance that I've been redistributing most frequently around the newsroom, but also to others as well, as our cross-border guidance, reminding people that when you cross international borders, your legal rights are probably at their lowest point. And if you're someone who's dependent on a visa to enter into a country, there's a tremendous amount of discretion that government has to allow you in, to revoke that visa, to put controls around that visa. And so a lot of the guidance that we're providing there isn't so much legal as practical. It's about maintaining the best possible hygiene. Come into a country with nothing on your phone so that if someone asks to see it, you have no reason to say no because you've removed those applications, because you've put on a global server that you can honestly answer you don't have access to at that moment any notes or transcripts or sensitive data, that you've done everything you can in advance to make that cross-border experience as easy as possible. And that's the type of guidance that we reiterate to the newsroom. Also just being mindful of all import and export controls. We've had very little issues in the past, but now we are getting more questions about taking video equipment, so professional cameras and such across borders, so being ready and making sure that all of our paperwork is, T's crossed, I's dotted, so that we don't get questioned. And that's not just, flying on airplanes, but that's in U.S., Canadian driving across borders as well, there's increased scrutiny. So again, knowing all of the technical rules and then being savvy. There are many guidelines online that you can find, just checklists about what to do when traveling that can really ease your way and make sure that you don't spend 8 hours in secondary like many of our folks have.
I would just say when the Canadians are nervous, you know it's bad. The other couple of, I guess, hygiene points I would add to what Katharine said, all good stuff, is, we'll tell the journalists to take a loaner laptop or burner phone, when they're crossing. You literally can't be too careful. And the other thing that I counsel them on, shockingly, sometimes journalists take documents home. Like, don't take anything sensitive home. Give it to me. I'll hold it.
I mean, I remember with the when the David Miranda was stopped at Heathrow Airport here, which is over 10, 12 years ago now. But one of the issues, which is still a live issue here, is that if you're stopped at the border here and the police ask you for your password for your phone, it's an offence not to give it to them, and that's the UK. So just simply having your phone, and as lawyers or as journalists, the stuff you keep on your phone, and all personal stuff as well. And your phone is this thing that has got all of it there, easily accessible once someone gets your passcode. So, just those basic things. Again, trying to
one more tip is know how your phone works. So one of the things, we had 2 journalists who were arrested on espionage charges. They had done absolutely nothing wrong. Walon and Choseu are journalists in Myanmar who were exposing a massacre at that time. The WhatsApp group that Choseu was on was just a group of journalists in the Rakhine area that were sharing notes and information. He didn't realize that any document that was shared, so any photograph that was shared, was being automatically saved into his photo folder on his phone. And so all of a sudden during questioning, it came after him. You have this classified document, this classified document. We couldn't figure out where it came from. It wasn't relevant to the work that he came to us. It just turned out that it had been shared among journalists in that area. And he just didn't know that there was a switch that could say, don't save everything from my WhatsApp group in my photo folder. But things like that, truly understanding what's on your phone, becomes essential when you end up in a defendant in an espionage case.
If you lose these hygiene battles, then everything's exposed.
Yeah, and I'll just add on, I think risk assessment plans need to be very personalized and also very comprehensive. So by personal, I mean, it's no longer, going into country X versus country Y. It's what is your personal background? What nationalities do you hold? Languages? Where have you transited? Where are you transiting through? Where have you been before? I mean, what have you reported on? I mean, all those personal items are relevant to your risk assessment plan. And by comprehensive, it has to cover digital hygiene, as we've talked about, where you keep papers, physical safety, legal plan. Who are you going to call if there's an issue? What are the local laws? Do you know what your rights are in every jurisdiction? What's the comms plan, and so forth? So we need to look at things personal and also very comprehensively.
Cool. I think we're almost at an end. So I've just got one quick throwaway question for each of you, which is what keeps you up at night at the moment? You may all say the same thing, but shall we just go down the line?
Shall I start?
Yeah, you
okay.
start. Yeah.
All of this?
Yeah, all of this.
All of this. It is all of this, but I'll try to break that down very, very simply. I worry about how all of this plays together. As we've noted, nothing happens in isolation. None of this is random. This is all very systemic. So the way everything interacts together is a key worry. I also worry about, sorry, I'm going to give 3 things. I also worry about how things are changing, right? The tactics against journalists and against the press are constantly changing. They're becoming so much more sophisticated and complex and nuanced, which makes them harder to spot and harder to tackle, and requires us as lawyers to equip ourselves better. And the third thing, which is related, is what's the impact this is all going to have on society, on journalism, on the very idea of truth, quite honestly, and the impact for democracy.
For me, it's fundamentally, it's all of these issues, but on top of that, just the change in the business model of journalism, and how do we make sure that our newsrooms have the financial support that they need to continue in the future. the threats there are from authoritarian regimes and that dictator's handbook, but it's also from technology companies who think that all media content can be fairly used to feed their models and that they don't need to compensate news organizations for it, and other changes that mean that news organizations around the world are floundering in terms of their financial support, and it would be an absolute tragedy if we lost them because they couldn't figure out a new business model. So I think this panel that we have later on this afternoon, I'll be all ears to hear the discussion on how we'll continue to make sure that journalism is financially as protected as it can be in the future.
All of that, and when I wake up, which sometimes is 3 a.m, which Dickensian-named claimant's law firm here is going to send me a letter saying, "Dear Mr. Shapiro, you may be familiar with the case of ZXC versus Bloomberg," every single time. The explosion of claimants' lawyers here, it's actually happening in the U.S. too. Some of these firms, they're like gremlins. You pour a little water and poof, you have more. But the uptick in letters, both here for sure, but also in the U.S. is a bit overwhelming.
Brilliant. Well, I'm afraid it's a rather gloomy note to end on, but it's been a fantastic panel and fascinating insight, I hope, for everybody in our 40 minutes, which obviously we could talk much longer about all of these things. But thank you very much. And if you'd like to...
Thank you.